it will help you decide what you want or what you need to learn. So the first one is one that I feel like is overlooked a lot, especially when it comes to like YouTube videos and so on. Typically, they just talk about front end, back end, full stack, but a web designer is pretty typical path to take, which is sort of like a mix of development and design. And these are people that are more focused on the front end, but don't really build complex UIs and applications. They stick to, static websites, small business websites, things like that. They may use a CMS like WordPress. They're usually pretty good at design as well as HTML and CSS, because a lot of times they go solo and they're freelancers, so they have to build their projects from the ground up. And they typically have some knowledge of programming, basic JavaScript, etc., but usually not enough to build a complex full stack application without using some kind of third-party software. So they get into kind of the business side of things, SEO, maybe some marketing, things like that. So if that sounds interesting to you, then you might take this route. Next, we have what is, I guess, the most common role that people start with, and that's a front-end developer. So this is someone that works on the client side of the web, so they work on the user interface, they create the interactions that a user has with a website or web app. Now, I will say that the lines between front-end and back-end are getting more blurred every day, especially with technologies like Next.js, where some of the page is rendered on the server and some of it's rendered on the client. But for the most part, front-end developers work on the client side of the web, with the most important technologies being HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in general. Most of the time, they'll also move on to front-end frameworks like React, Vue, Angular, and I'll talk more about those later. Next, we have a back-end developer. This is someone that works on the server side, so they work with databases, database ORMs. They're not focused on the user interface at all. They're usually the ones building the APIs that the front-end developers will consume and get data from the server. Now, with the front end, your programming language is typically going to be JavaScript, but on the back end, you have dozens of languages to choose from. You can use JavaScript, of course, with something like Node.js, but you can also use Python, PHP, C#, and many, many more languages, which we'll talk about later. Then you have a full stack developer who works on both the front and back end. So you'll need to know HTML, CSS, JavaScript, but also need to know a server-side language or server-side technology. You'll work with databases and ORMs just like a back-end developer. Now, in my experience, it seems that most full-stack positions are more focused on either the front end or the back end, but you still do need to know both. And again, that line is getting more and more blurred. And it seems that full stack is the most popular end goal for people. It seems, at least from what I see, running a channel and seeing a lot of developers and people that are coming up, it seems like front end is where they want to start, but ultimately they want to be full stack developers. Now, I'm going to throw a fifth role in there, and that's DevOps. And this is someone that's responsible for deployment and maintenance of your application, maintenance of the servers, their security, scalability. They do write code, but it's not the same as front end or back end development. You're not building the application, you're building the infrastructure that the application runs on. And you'll typically need to know technologies like Docker and Kubernetes. You'll need to know about certain hosting platforms like AWS. You might write Bash scripts, Python scripts, need to know how to manage a Linux server. This isn't really my wheelhouse, but it may be something that you're interested in, and it's usually a separate role than a software developer. Now, for the rest of this video, when we talk about certain technologies or concepts, I'm going to have the types of developers that it pertains to up in the left-hand corner here. So you'll see something like this with WD for web designer, front end, back end, full stack, and DevOps. And this will help you keep track for whatever your goals are. All right, so now we've talked about the different roles, let's talk about some goals and paths that you can take as a web developer. And one thing I want to mention that's really important is that your goals can change over time. So what you choose now doesn't mean you won't change it later. I've been doing this for about 15 years, and I've been a freelancer, a full-time employee, a consultant, an instructor, and I've done side projects. So you most likely won't do the same thing for your entire career. So don't feel like you're stuck with whatever you choose now. So the most common is to learn to code to become a full-time developer for a company. And this is where, you work for a company, you get salary, benefits. Your pay can vary greatly depending on where you live and what company you work for. But it's a very stable job, and you don't have to worry about finding clients or anything like that. You just show up, you do your job. Hopefully you really like coding and you get to, do your passion for work, so it doesn't really feel like work. You get paid quite a bit. There's positions for all types, including the ones that we talked about. Many developers strive to work at like a FANG company, which is, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google. These are some of the biggest tech companies in the world, and they pay very well. However, there's a lot of companies out there that pay just as well, if not better. So don't feel like you have to work for one of these huge corporations. There's so many companies out there. So freelancing is another option, and this is for developers that are somewhat business savvy. It definitely isn't for everyone. There's a lot of added stress in running your own business, but it can be incredibly rewarding in many ways. You'll probably struggle financially at first, depending on where you're starting out, but if you gain the experience and you put your all into it, you can possibly make much more than you could at a 9 to 5 as a software developer. And freelancing is essentially investing in yourself. And you do need to know quite a bit. You kind of have to be a jack of all trades, master of none, because typically you're starting out solo, so you'll need to do everything from the design to the HTML, CSS, to whatever you're using for a backend, if you do have a backend, or if you're using WordPress. Typically you're going to go for technologies that allow you to create things fast. And you could also niche down and work with certain industries. So for instance, you might do medical websites or something like that. There's so many different routes to take within the route of freelancer. So another option you have is to work for a startup, which is a little different than working for a large company. It's pretty risky because most startups do fail. That's just a fact. But if you're one of the first employees, it can be very, very rewarding, and you can be very successful and make a ton of money. And then you could also think about starting your own startup later on down the line. I wouldn't say that should be your first goal once you learn how to code. And that kind of leads us to the next one, which is to create a product or a SaaS, which is a software as a service. So you could build some kind of app that you could charge monthly for, so you have recurring income. And I would say this is great for a secondary goal. So maybe start off either as a full-time employee or a freelancer and work on a product that you think will be successful in your spare time. And then, if that starts to grow, you could always switch over and do that full-time. And then internships, they do offer real-world experience. There's paid internships, and even if it's not paid, you do get a lot of experience, and it looks great on your resume for when it is, when it comes time to find a job. And typically, internships that aren't paid, they will lead to a paid position. So it's a great option if, just to get you going in the industry. So these are just some of the things you can do. These are, I would say, the most common, especially the first two, full-time employee, freelancer. There's a lot of things that I would say you can do, but I wouldn't suggest starting out with, like consulting, like teaching, things like that. Again, like I said earlier, you don't have to stick with one thing once you choose that path. All right, so let's get into some of the basic essential tools that you need to start coding. So first, obviously, you need a computer with an operating system. People ask me all the time, what's the best laptop for coding? The truth is you can use just about anything from the last 5 to 10 years for web development. If you were doing something like 3D modeling, then you need a bit more of a powerful computer. But for web development, you don't need much. I'd say just make sure you have at least 8 gigabytes of RAM and an SSD. I think the bigger decision is what operating system you want to use, but even that really just comes down to preference. People ask me what I prefer. I like Mac OS just because things seem to work a bit more smoothly, especially when it comes to things like the terminal. I think that Windows has gotten a lot better though, and I do use Windows, I'd say probably 30% of the time. I just prefer Mac OS for my serious projects. And then obviously you have Linux, which is a great option because you can kind of mimic your production environments, and it's very beneficial to learn Linux server administration if you're going to be doing any kind of DevOps. All right, again, it just comes down to preference. So a text editor, this is where you'll write your code, and there's a lot of options out there. Personally, I prefer Visual Studio Code. It's free, it's open source, it's very powerful, it's very customizable. I'd say about 80 to 90% of the web developers that I talk to use VS Code. Some other options are Sublime Text, which technically isn't free, but it has a trial that never ends. If you do use it for a long time, I would suggest paying for it. There's Atom, which is free and open source. Vim is also pretty popular. It's a bit more advanced than the others. It has quite a learning curve, but it's very powerful, and the people that use it swear by it. And you don't really have to use your mouse at all, so you can be very, very efficient and fast writing your code. So there's also IDEs, which are integrated development environments. They have a little bit more features than a standard text editor. You don't really need an IDE for most types of web development, but there are some that are geared towards specific languages. For instance, you have PyCharm for Python developers, you have PHP Storm for PHP developers. So that may be something you want to look into, but ultimately, I would definitely recommend VS Code to most people. As far as web browsers go, that's really preference. I'm sure that all of you already have a preference. I like Chrome. There's not really a specific reason. It just does everything I need to. I like the dev tools. I think Chrome and Firefox would be the two most popular. Firefox also has great dev tools, maybe a little better than Chrome. You could even use Microsoft Edge. I came up in the Internet Explorer days, and Microsoft browsers were just horrible. I remember IE6, and it was just a nightmare. But now Edge actually uses Chromium under the hood, so you could just as well use that. Safari, I'm not too crazy about. Brave is really cool for privacy features, Brave and Vivaldi. And then there's a newer browser called Polypane, which is directed toward web development, but it's not free. And personally, I'm not going to pay for a browser. Chrome does everything I need. So it's just preference. And then for terminals, it used to be that front-end developers didn't really need to use a terminal for much, but now with all the framework CLIs and NPM and Git, you do need to know at least the basics. So as far as terminal programs go, I think the default in Mac OS or most Linux distros are great. For Windows used to really suck with terminals with the CMD command prompt. I never really could get into PowerShell. But now the Windows terminal isn't bad. It has SSH. You used to have to use tools like PuTTY. I prefer Git Bash on Windows, which is a third-party bash terminal. But you could also use the Windows subsystem for Linux. It is a bit more advanced, though, so I wouldn't suggest that for beginners. And then for Linux, obviously, you have tons of third-party terminals. You have Terminator, Alacrity. For Mac OS, I'll either use the default or iTerm 2, which just has a little more features, and I think it looks a little better. All right, so now we've come to the first big part of learning to be a web developer, and that is HTML and CSS. So these two technologies are essentially the building blocks of the visual part of the web. HTML is a markup language that's used to structure the content of a web page, and then CSS, Cascading Style Sheets, is the styling language that's used to style the content. So you can think of HTML as the skeleton and CSS as the skin. You can't have one without the other. HTML itself is actually very, very simple. It's just a bunch of tags that you use to structure your content. So as far as what you want to learn about HTML, you want to learn how to create semantic markup. This means using the correct tags for the correct content. You also want to learn about accessibility. This is making sure that your content is accessible to everyone, including people with disabilities. You want to learn all the common tags and attributes, so things like headings, paragraphs, lists. There's a lot of older deprecated tags that you don't even have to bother with. I would say semantic tags, excuse me, like header and footer are very, very important. So spend some time learning how to structure your pages semantically. And then CSS is a much different, more complex technology. It's a styling language that's used to style the content of a web page. It's very powerful and it's constantly evolving. There's a lot to learn about CSS. You want to learn about all the core properties for things like colors, fonts, the box model, which is how elements are laid out and spaced on the page, and how to use margin, padding, borders. Specificity is important because sometimes you'll have multiple styles that apply to the same element, and you need to know which one will be applied. And the different units of measurements like pixels, ems, rems, and percentages. You'll want to learn about different types of selectors like classes, IDs. There's also what we call pseudo selectors. You want to learn about the different layout methods like flexbox and grid. These are used to lay out your elements in columns and rows. And then responsive design is really important. All of your projects should look good no matter what device they're being viewed on. You know, there's a few elements to responsive design, but media queries are probably the most important. This is where you can apply different styles based on the size of the screen. So you definitely want to be familiar with responsive design. So next we have CSS frameworks. Now at this point, these are optional and you could just go right to JavaScript. However, these frameworks can make things much easier when it comes to creating layouts. They're also very popular and a lot of companies use them. And they're pretty easy to learn when comparing it to other technologies like a programming language. So my personal advice would be to spend a week or two learning one of these frameworks. And there's a ton to choose from. However, these are the main four that I would suggest looking at. And to be even more specific, I'd say the first two, but that's just my opinion. So Bootstrap is one of the original CSS frameworks. It's been around since, I believe, 2011. And it's a very widely used technology and has a large community, which is always a plus. It's component-based, which means that there's a lot of pre-built classes that you can use for things like buttons, cards, nav bars, etc. And the upside to this is that you can create UIs and websites really quickly, and you have less classes in your HTML. The downside is that sometimes Bootstrap websites can look pretty similar. Now, it's fair to say that you can really customize Bootstrap and make it look however you want, but you will have to learn Sass, which is a CSS preprocessor, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Bootstrap also has an easy-to-use grid system that a lot of people like. However, I definitely wouldn't suggest using it just for that because you have CSS Grid or Flexbox, which are built into CSS. So you don't need to use Bootstrap just for the grid. Another plus to Bootstrap is you get a set of JavaScript widgets like modals, carousels, and drop-downs. And this is great for people that don't have a lot of JavaScript experience and still want that functionality. So I'd say Bootstrap is one of the best tools for freelancers because you can create websites and layouts very quickly. Now, Tailwind CSS seems to be the most popular right now as far as, content that you see out there and what people are talking about. You see it everywhere in new projects. A lot of startups are using it. It's a utility-first CSS framework that allows you to build custom designs without pretty much ever leaving your HTML. And being utility-first makes it a bit different than the rest of these because instead of having a class for, let's say, a button, which would generally have multiple styles, you have a class for each style. So you'll have a class for the background color, for the text color, for the padding. So you almost never have to write any custom CSS because every CSS property has a class. The downside to this is you end up with a ton of classes in your HTML. But the upside is that you can really customize your layout and they don't all look the same, which can be an issue with a lot of these other options. All right, so next we have Balma, which is a newer framework that I really like. It has some good looking components and it's really easy to use as far as class names go. It's not as popular as Bootstrap or Tailwind. It's also not as customizable as Tailwind, but it is very fast and lightweight, and I think it looks good. Then you have Materialize, which has been around for a while. It uses Google's material design system. And as far as component-based frameworks go, I think Materialize is one of the best looking. Obviously, that's just my opinion. There's a ton of components to choose from, and there's also JavaScript widgets like modals and drop-downs, similar to what you would get with Bootstrap. From what I can tell, its popularity has come down since the release of Tailwind, but it's still a very viable option. And some other frameworks out there are Semantic UI, Foundation, UIKit. I'm not going to go over all of them because they're all pretty similar. Once you learn one, it's pretty easy to pick up another one. So SAS is another option that you may want to learn around this time. It's a CSS preprocessor that adds extra functionality to CSS. So it allows you to write CSS with variables and functions, mix-ins. Native CSS is catching up with SAS features. For instance, we have custom properties in CSS, which are essentially variables. They're not as clean looking as SAS variables, but they basically do the same thing. There's still a lot that SAS can do that CSS can't, though. So you can nest and inherit styles, which is a very helpful feature. I would say learn SAS if you're using a framework like Bootstrap where you need to customize the styles. Also, it can make your CSS very modular, so you can separate it into different files and then you can import them into one another. And this makes it easier to maintain. You basically create your own CSS framework and you have a separate file for things like button styles or navbar styles. It's been around for a while. There are other CSS preprocessors like Less and Stylus, but they kind of just faded away. SAS has a really good ecosystem of both command line tools and GUI tools to compile it, because you can't use SAS files directly in the browser, right? You can't just include them like you can CSS. You have to compile it down to regular CSS, and there's different tools that allow you to do that. It's also great for theming, so where you want to have different color options and things like that. It is optional, but again, it's something that's really easy to learn, so why not learn it? You could learn it in a weekend. And I have a crash course that pretty much shows you all the features that you need to know.